Yes. Our speaker tonight is Dan Rubenstein. He's a professor of zoology and the chair of Princeton's Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. He received his PhD from Duke University and did postdoctoral studies at Cambridge University. He is an elected fellow of the Animal Behavior Society, as well as the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He has received Princeton University's President's Award for Distinguished Teaching. Professor Rubenstein studies how environmental variation and individual differences shape social behavior, social structure, and the dynamics of populations. He has special interests in all species of wild horses, zebras, as you can see, and asses. And there are several variations of asses. And has done field work on them throughout the world. In Kenya, he also works with pastoral communities to develop a data-gathering scout program, as well as curricular modules for local schools to raise awareness about the plight of the endangered Grevy's zebra. He has recently extended his work to measuring the effects of environmental change, including management and global warming. I have to go on to say that he also has a career in the ballet. You may not have realized that sometimes professors have other careers, and has played Herr Drosselmeyer in The Nutcracker on many occasions when his daughter was dancing. I'm going to move this because I think it'll make it easier. Please welcome Dan Rubenstein.
Thank you, Ruth. Can everybody hear me? You can't? Is the microphone not working? Oh, it's okay.
Did you turn it on?
Yeah, I turned it on.
I'll make it lower.
There's a green light.
Okay.
Okay, can people hear me now? Okay, good. Well, welcome. We're going to talk about Africa. We're going to talk about sustainable development. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, we're first going to learn something about two indicator species. Zebras are the most common wildlife on the African savanna. One of the species is flourishing, the common zebra or plain zebra, Equus burchellii, and there's the endangered Grevy's zebra, Equus grevii. This one, there's over 1 million left in Africa. This one is under 2,000. So part of the understanding of the dynamics of these species represents a way to examine how wildlife and people can coexist, because we have to understand what has caused the one species to flourish and the other not to flourish. My talk tonight is going to be divided into 3 sections. Ultimately, we're going to explore the problems facing people and wildlife in Kenya. In order to do that, we're going to illustrate the role that science plays in conserving and managing zebras and enhancing economic development. We're trying to understand the ways in which we make decisions, informed decisions, to both simultaneously preserve biodiversity while at the same time enhancing livelihoods of peoples that are not doing particularly well on the landscapes that they share with wildlife. To do that, we're going to learn something about zebras and their behavior and their ecology so we can understand through a lens of wildlife how a landscape looks when people also use that landscape. So that's the 3 sections of the talk. So let's start with what are the problems facing people and wildlife in Kenya. Can we ultimately figure out a way for eco-friendly development? Kenya, at the time of independence, had a very high GDP. You can look at the breakdown in the various parts, but overall, the growth rate of the economy was very, very high right after independence. And it declined steadily for the next 35 years. Until the 90s, under President Moi, the economy was barely ticking along. The economy picked up in the years 2000s and was doing quite well until the post-election violence last year. Then Kenya's economy has fallen off the table again, and there's been very little progress in terms of development, in terms of fixing the courts and constitutional reform. And so some of the bad habits that have occurred in the past are creeping in to the people's lifestyles today. But if the economy, which has natural resources, can rebound and get to this high growth rate, it still represents a problem, because not everyone in Kenya benefits equally. The people that live in the semi-arid lands where rainfall is between 400 and 500 millimeters are not doing particularly well. Here is a typical Samburu woman doing what women do, which is collect firewood and water to keep the family alive. Men tend to herd. And these people in particular are not participating in the rapid growth economy that's potential for Kenya. So the question is, what is going on their landscapes? The problems that face people ultimately are related to the tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons comes from work by the British economists when looking at the landscape in Britain. And when you had a common land where people put out their livestock to graze, there was always pressure for people to put one extra cow on that landscape. By doing so, the costs are amortized by everybody. That one extra cow is not going to take that much more grass. Everybody's animals will suffer a little bit, but imperceptibly. But the person that puts that extra cow out there gets the full economic benefit of that extra cow. Once one person does it, others are induced to do the same, until eventually everybody's put an extra cow or two out on that landscape. The landscape gets overgrazed, degradation takes place, everybody pays the full cost and more, and their profits go down. So the greedy gain for a while, but mutual ruin eventually comes to all. And Garrett Hardin's solution sounds quite simple, that people must figure out a way to mutually coerce each other in a way they can all agree upon. We tend to do that by the state. We empower governments to tax us, to punish us, and to punish cheats in particular. But how do people come to an understanding of coercing themselves, policing themselves, in a way that's agreed upon by everybody? Where are the rules, whether formal or informal, that prevents cheating on a common landscape? Pastoral people share landscapes. The original pastoral peoples were able to move wherever they wanted to, wherever the rainfall let them. And so they'd move their herds for hundreds of kilometers from one place to another when one area dried out and the other area was richer. Other people were in those other places, and they had to work out rules of reciprocity or rely on kinship to allow them these relationships to graze where the rainfall was producing grass and drinking points. But people did this. Over time, populations have grown, and governments, for whatever reason governments do, tend to sedentarize people. And by sedentarizing them, that then creates a more territorial system, which is no longer necessarily in sync to the broad rain gradients that cover much greater distances than the small pieces of land that governments give people. So the original paddle of transhumanists, where you had pastoral people moving their herds around and averaging across landscapes where aridity was the main driver, is starting to change. And so how on a landscape can you now, that's sedentarizing people, how can you come to mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon? The solution ultimately will depend on scientific and engineering innovation, ways better to use that landscape more efficiently, but it's going to depend as much on understanding and addressing human concerns. So again, if we're trying to balance livestock with wildlife on a landscape, we have to understand what people want, what matters to people, and their institutions in order to come up with ecological and engineering solutions that will be useful to people as they change and modify their behavior. The problem for wildlife is quite different from that of people. People make their own problems, but people also make problems for the wildlife. Here are some historical ranges of the plain zebra, which range all the way from East Africa all the way down into Southern Africa, and the original historical ranges of the Grevy's zebra, which was in Somalia and Sudan and Ethiopia and Eritrea. Today, the ranges have shrunk. So the plain zebra, even though there's 1 million left in Africa, no longer range over the same area that they did just 100 years ago. Populations have been fragmented, populations have been shrunk in terms of size. The Grevy zebra has been extirpated from certain areas completely, and the present-day range is only a small part of the historical range. So these are changes wrought by people. The consequences can be quite dramatic. So here's the Grevy zebra. When I started studying them in the late 70s, early 80s, there were roughly 15,000 in the world. Nowadays, there's fewer than 2,000. Even on the Lewa Conservancy, where until very recently cattle were not allowed at all, the numbers increased until 1999, and then numbers have slowly dropped from 600 to 400. So even in the most well-preserved areas, where contact with people has been minimized, the Grevy zebra is not flourishing. And you can see where they interact with people, their flourishing is even more diminished. The plain zebra, on the other hand, numbers are increasing. So what about those two species are very, very different that allows one to flourish and the other not to? To answer that question, we need to understand something about the societies of the two species. There are two species, as I said, the Grevy zebra and the plain zebra, and the tattoos are very different in terms of their sociality. The two societies can be characterized depending on the strength of the relationship between males and females. In the plain zebra, females bond to a particular male and live with him more or less permanently, often for months, if not years, if not a whole lifetime. So it leads to the so-called harem group, or a uni-male, multi-female group. It's a polygynous mating society in the sense that one male has many different females, but from the female perspective, it's monoandrous. These females all choose to mate and be stably related to one male. So it's polygyny from the male perspective, monoandry from the female perspective. And it leads to a tight social system where bonds are strong. The Grevy zebra, on the other hand, female relationships are weak. Females change their association often hourly or daily. So females don't stay with any particular female for a long period of time. And males, as a consequence, don't stay with females much at all. Instead, males tend to be territorial, isolate themselves from each other, and try to encourage females to stay and linger for long periods of time with the male. By doing that, the male is also polygynous because he will mate with all the females in estrus that pass through his territory. But from a female perspective, the society is fundamentally different. Instead of monoandry, it's polyandry because these females may mate with this male and then this male. So the females have multiple mates. So the societies are very, very different from the male-female perspective. How does this have consequences on their use of the landscape and their interaction with people? This is something we're going to see. Now, first of all, as a behavioral ecologist, we want to know why it is these two societies respond differently to a similar landscape. And in part, it has to do with the fact that the species have different body size, that males and females of the Grevy zebra need more food. They can subsist on lower quality food because of size-scaling relationships that change metabolic demand. So the two species may see the same landscape, the same vegetation, but they, in a sense, interpret it differently because of their different physiologies. The plain zebra, the male, is the hub of the society. So this is our sociogram with the male in the middle. Strong bonds by females to the male because the male represents something of value to the females, as we'll see, and weaker bonds amongst the females themselves. So we have a wagon wheel type of sociogram where the male is the hub, strong relationships are the spokes as the female is bonded to the male, and weaker but significant relationships among the females providing the rim to our stable society. What benefit does the male provide? The male provides foraging benefits to the female. It also produces reductions in sexual harassment by other males. The two changes allow females to graze very effectively and raise their offspring. So here's a graph of group size, the harem size from 4 to 10 females, and this is the percent time that females spend grazing. If there was strong competition in the society, you'd expect a statistically significant negative relationship. We don't see that here. As groups get larger, females are not interfering with each other as they forage. They can spend the same amount of time foraging, and we can also show that their bite rate doesn't change either. So their ability to ingest food is independent of the number of females around them. And in part, that's because a grass blade is a grass blade. So females can spread out to avoid negatively impacting the foraging behavior of each other. Where the male comes into play is that females that choose to be with dominant males, those of high rank, so those that win contests with other males and exert their dominance, those females get more free reign on a landscape than females that stay with subordinate males. And so as a consequence, the number of herds that a male inflicts upon his females per hour is lower for a high-ranking stallion than a low-ranking stallion. And the consequence of that is that the females graze about 6 minutes more per hour, which is statistically significant, but it's also biologically significant because horses and zebras are grass vacuum cleaners. They graze about 20 hours per day. And so that comes to about 2 hours difference between females that associate with high-ranking males as opposed to low-ranking males. And as a consequence, if you look at the number of surviving offspring that a female has, those with high-ranking males have more offspring and spread more of their genes in the future generations than low-ranking, the females that associate with low-ranking males. So females are choosy. By choosing males of high quality, females increase their reproductive success or their Darwinian fitness. And so that's what leads to the wagon wheel mating system, because females choose males that provide extra time and reduction in harassment that lead to changes in reproductive success. If the harem system is so good, then why is it that the Grevy zebra doesn't show the same pattern? And the reason is that different classes of females do not bond with each other. And the reason is that this increase in body size, putting pressure on females to get as much food as they can because they have higher overall metabolic demands, means that females of different reproductive states or classes cannot stay with each other because their needs on a common landscape are different. On the plains zebras, lactating females and non-lactating females also have different needs, but because everybody has to drink every day, they go together in a group, and that allows them to all benefit by the presence of a male. In Grevy zebra, we see a big divide between females that don't lactate and females that do lactate and have foals that are less than 3 months of age. If you put points randomly on a map and look at the distribution of those points from the nearest drinking site throughout the dry season, early, mid, and late, you can see there's a slow increase in any point's distribution from a watering point. And if you look at what non-lactating females are doing, they're basically distributing themselves randomly on the landscape. Water doesn't mean that much to them. But the early females that are lactating with early foals are found statistically significantly much closer to water than their non-lactating counterparts. The water they want is water that's limited to open areas where there's safety against predators for their youngsters. And so these females are staying near water, water of a certain type, whereas the other females that don't need to drink every day, they only need to drink every 3 to 5 days, head off far from water to look for bulk, food, lots of vegetation. And this tears the social fabric amongst the females, and which means that the males are stuck because both classes of females are equally valuable to him. The females that have just given birth, that stay near water with the young foals, have a cycle that starts reproductively 3 weeks after they give birth. The other females spontaneously cycle every 2.5 weeks. So what's a male to do? He wants to be with both sets of ladies, and they're going in different directions. And so what the male does is he defends territories, points of interception for females that come and go to water and food every 3 to 5 days, and provides refuges for females that stay near water with their young foals. Then they gain the benefit of being with the male, much like a harem of females does for the plains zebra. But the other females are free to go to get the bulk that they need. And so that's how the same ecology translates into different societies and social relationships of these two zebras. Now, armed with this background on the biology of the animals, we can start to understand how when people put pressure on a landscape, it's going to have a differential impact on this species as opposed to the other species. Now, the question then, the last part, is to examine, can livelihoods of people be enhanced while wildlife is conserved? And our test case will be, can we protect and conserve the Grevy zebra while increasing the lifestyles and the quality of life for the pastoral people that use the landscape? And so the West had a way of doing it. And Little Red Riding Hood depicts very nicely what we did. We wiped out our wildlife as we industrialized America. As the colonists moved across the landscape, the first thing they did is they got rid of the predators, they got rid of their wildlife, they transformed the prairie into farms, and they made a ton of money. And that money then allowed wealth to be generated by investing in the Industrial Revolution. And that's what the West did. Now, as we get wealthy, we say we want to increase the quality of life. We build national parks to provide refuges for what wildlife is left. We repopulate from zoos wildlife that we want in those national parks to increase ecosystem function. And so we often set up protected areas, and protected areas take time to happen. You gazette a protected area inside the species' normal range. You establish in Congress or in Parliament if you're in Africa. You actually build the refuge, and then development takes place around it and locks your refuge into an island that prevents natural movements of species and individuals across the landscape. And so you get Island 1, Island 2, Island 3, and eventually you get development in the non-protected areas so that your island is now completely isolated. And by various biological theories, we know that if you make a common land into an island, a certain number of species are going to go extinct. It's the theory of island biogeography. That's the first problem with refuges. And the big-bodied species that need to range widely are the first species to go extinct. And so something like the Grevy zebra that goes back and forth over large distances with females moving off to feed or some staying for water, and everybody needs to do this at different points in their life because they're going to have kids at different times, all of a sudden can find that a reserve is too constraining, too confining, and certain species are going to be lost. So we can establish reserves. It certainly is important to do so. National parks are incredibly valuable, but they're not going to be the panacea, and they're not necessarily going to protect every species. And more importantly, peoples that develop around it contribute to this problem of isolation. So the lifestyle enhancement is not necessarily going to protect your biodiversity. Second, as climate change takes place, what was once the old southern boundary in this case, where the habitat was good and the climate was good and the food and water resources were good, all of a sudden can migrate and leave your refuge outside the range of tolerance for the species you're concerned with. So as climate change will either dry areas or make areas more wet, the ideal species for those areas may change. So there's no guarantee a refuge is going to be the panacea for all times in the future. So this is the way the Western country, developed, got wealthy, preserved some of their species. And the process follows, for certain resources, what's called an environmental Kuznets curve. As the per capita income of people increase, the environmental harm that they provide on a landscape first increases as you get industrialization, and then as the quality of life becomes a critical issue, investment to clean up the water and clean up the air can lower the environmental harm. And traditionally, it's seen that in agricultural societies, the footprint of people is small. They're not particularly wealthy. They don't particularly pollute. But through the process of industrialization, that's where the harm increases until we become a service economy and we start to invest in improving the quality of life, cleaning up our environment, and providing benefits to wildlife species. But the question then becomes, does economic growth require environmental degradation? Is there an alternative way to run this movie? Can we move from the agricultural, pastoral society to one where people's livelihoods are increased without the degradation and the improvement, just maintain the environmental integrity while we develop the economies of people? And that's the experiment we're trying to perform, and we're trying to analyze by the results of our analyses and our studies in East Africa. So the question then becomes, is such an alternative possible, and can such an alternative coexist with wildlife and people on private lands, where private lands come in a variety of forms? So this is Laikipia in Kenya and Samburu, two government districts, and they're both located right here in the center of Kenya. You can see in Laikipia, there's a lot of different colors, and each one of those colors represents a different land use. And so you can have near the water towers, so to speak, where you've got Mount Kenya, the Aberdares, and the escarpment from the Rift Valley, where rainfall is going to be high, you can have agriculture around the periphery of Laikipia because you've got rainfall and runoff water that would allow non-irrigation agriculture to take place. In the more dry areas where rainfall is between 400 and 500 meters, you can have commercial ranches that try to make a profit on cattle rearing, and the group ranches, which are the sedentarized pastoral people. The government gives each pastoral community about 15,000 hectares that they then have group property rights over, and they can try to manage their livestock and make their livelihoods. And the problem then becomes is the old relationship of being able to move across this land freely is now impeded by this group ranch's boundary with this group ranch, and new forms of relationships have to develop that are different from the old marriage rules and the old reciprocity. Money is needed to buy grazing rights. And so the land use patterns change as development changes and the needs change because of governmental changes. And so the question is, on this multiple land use landscape, can we envisage a way to move from low impact and low livelihoods to low impact and richer livelihoods? And now Kenya's wildlife, 70% of it roams on landscape like this. There are very few protected areas in this habitat. You've got Buffalo Springs, Samburu and Shaba County Council reserves here. You've got the Mukogoto Forest, which for religious reasons no one logs. Those are the only protected areas, and they represent a small fragment of the total ecosystem of Laikipia and Samburu. So in short, can wildlife pay to stay when faced with multiple strategies of using that landscape? What I'd like to do now is examine 3 different types of lifestyles and see how people use their landscape and what impact they have on the wildlife to see if each one of these landowners can in fact find a way to coexist with the wildlife and have a livelihood that benefits them. The 3 scenarios will start off with the financially well-off, the middle class, that are the commercial ranchers that are making a profit out of large-scale agriculture in terms of cattle rearing. Then there's the financially strapped, the smallholders that own maybe 1,000 acres at most that will use the landscape, and they're looking for different economies of scale in terms of how to make a living with livestock on their lands. And then there's finally the financially challenged, the traditional pastoralists that have no recourse to capital. They can't get loans, they can't get banks to invest in them, they can't improve their land, so they have to use the lands in a traditional way under these new government regulations. And so we'll look at 3 case studies to try to understand whether each one can coexist with wildlife and improve or maintain their livelihoods. So let's start with the first 2, the middle class and the financially strapped, but not the challenged. And this is going to be, can we manage plain zebras on the private lands? And we'll look at 2 scenarios, one sharing the rangeland with wildlife, those that are trying to make the biggest profit and have large holdings, and those that have small holdings that want to have utilization. They want to be able to cull the wildlife and make a profit over the skins, not the meat, of the wildlife, because there's no markets in Kenya for meat. If there were markets, there'd be a black market, and then the wildlife would be all exterminated. So until about 5 years ago, Kenya Wildlife Service and the government allowed culling, where you'd give the meat to your dogs and to your workers, and you'd salt the skin, and you'd sell the skins to South Africa for tanning, and then they'd sell them to you for about $1,000. Okay? So the Kenyans didn't make $1,000 on a zebra. They made some money, but it was mainly the South Africans that made most of the money. So let's look at the first scenario. The first scenario is the financially well-off and sharing the rangeland with livestock and wildlife. Now, there's an age-old saw that every rancher knows. You ask a rancher, do they like wildlife? And they'll tell you, absolutely not, because wildlife will eat the grass that could go to my cow, my sheep, my goats, or my camels. And so every rancher will tell you, get rid of the wildlife because it's vermin. I need to make a profit. It's very difficult to make a livelihood as a farmer, especially if you're going to husband animals. And so we went out to test whether, in fact, competition occurs between cattle and zebras, or was there the possibility, which we know occurs in ecological communities, is there some sort of facilitation? We know on the African landscape that when you have zebras, wildebeests, and gazelles, that the zebras change the landscape by eating the straw, which facilitates the wildebeest, who are slightly smaller in body size and also have a rumen stomach, so they need to eat higher quality food for their weight, equivalent weight for a cecal fermenter, a hindgut fermenter, which the zebras are. They need higher quality food, so they benefit by the zebras eating away the straw, so the green growth in the moist soil can come back to life and they provide the nutrition that the wildebeest need. The wildebeest need a lot of food, so they crop it down, and then they make it even more stimulatory for the gazelles that need even higher quality food because their body sizes are even smaller. And so that's the grazing succession, the facilitation. Is it possible that zebras and cattle interact in a facilitating way rather than a competitive way? And the way we designed these experiments is we used 4.5 square kilometers of the Impala Research Center, which Princeton, Smithsonian, Kenya Wildlife Service, and Kenya National Museums co-manage. We used 4.5 square kilometers to run this large-scale experiment for 6 months, where we had mixtures or pure stands of cattle and donkeys. Now, donkeys are domestic asses, and asses have the same guts, the same diets, the same teeth row that zebras and horses do. And the donkeys have the same social system that the Grevy zebra do. They're all members of the same genus Equus. They're evolutionarily closely related. They have the same body plan and the same ability to process food. And the benefit of donkeys is they are domesticated, which means if we can follow cattle and see exactly what cattle are eating, we can follow donkeys and see exactly what donkeys are eating. We can't do that with zebras because we can't work on foot with them because they run away. So by substituting donkeys for zebras, we gain some insights into how cattle and zebras interact because we can watch how cattle and donkeys interact. So we can do these experiments on Impala, which is the size of a typical commercial ranch, 55,000 acres, over 25,000 hectares, lots of land. And we then had herds of pure cattle, herds of pure donkeys, or mixtures. Now, if they competed, the performance in the mixtures should do less well in terms of growth and live weight change than if they were in pure. On the other hand, if they facilitate each other, the mixtures should do better than the pure stands of cattle or donkeys at the same densities, under the same conditions. And so we had different parcels of land with the same number of animals and different mixtures to be able to look at this experimentally. We also used 2 stocking levels. The pastoralists stocked their land very highly, very densely, 1 animal for every 2 hectares. Commercial ranches understock their land from the pastoralist perspective. They put 1 animal for every 7 hectares. So they don't impact their landscape as heavily. So we ran 2 stocking levels, the low, which is the commercial ranch, and the high at the pastoral, in exactly the same mixtures of pure cattle, pure donkeys, or both. And we looked at weight change, we looked at what they ate, we looked at feeding rate, and we looked at parasites. We collected the dung, we looked at the eggs per gram of the various nematode worms that get in the guts of the cattle and the donkeys. So we were examining the physiology as well as the ecology and the behavior. And we also looked at their impact on the landscape. So we had a series of fixed points that were repeatedly measured over the 6 months to see how they were impacting the vegetation. The results were quite striking. We first used a series of local high school leavers that were just ordinary herders, and we employed them. And they lived with the cattle for 6 months. We had a graduate student from one of the Kenya universities, and Meha Jain, my undergraduate, who did her senior thesis on this work, worked with the project. And we weighed the animals every 2 weeks by putting them in this box and lifting the box and measuring their weight change. And these guys walked with the cattle, measuring everything that they ate. Okay? And we could measure the landscape by dropping pins along their route and seeing how many leaves or stems, green or brown, to measure abundance and quality, was there. And these are the results. So this is performance, the weight change, and we looked at live weight change, and we could see that the gray, which is the mixed, outperforms the pure stands of either cattle or donkeys, whether low or high density. So we show a very dramatic facilitatory non-competitive effect. one of the first large-scale field experiments to demonstrate this. So this is good news to the commercial ranchers because it indicates that if they allow lots of wildlife on their landscape, then like the donkeys in our mixed herds, they will somehow be facilitating the growth of the cattle on that landscape. Now, how does this come about? It comes about because the bite rate, which is what our herders were recording, is higher in the mixed stands, mixtures of species, than in the pure species. So the benefit of having the two species together, it sped up the ingestion rate. And how did this come about? It comes about because the cattle benefit by increased access to food because the donkeys shift the relative abundance of one of the major species, Ceteria, by changing its structure. They ate away all the straw, and when the light summer rains occur, the new growth was abundant and more evenly distributed and more accessible to the cattle, which feed by their tongues pulling on the vegetation. So the cattle benefited by increased access by just being more bulk being present because the tall stuff was taken away. The donkeys changed the structure. But they also increased the quality. The donkeys increased the greenness of the vegetation, again, by allowing more infiltration of water into the soil, that these species, Pennisetum mesianum, Pennisetum straminium, and Ceteria, all low quality when they are straw and brown, tend to have higher crude protein levels when they're green. So with the August rain stimulating growth due to the donkeys increasing the change in structure led to higher quality food as well as more food available for the cattle. We also saw that the donkeys benefited by the parasite levels being reduced in the mixed plots. The parasite levels in the donkeys went down by 35%, and all the values were less than 1,500, which the critical value for sickness is 2,000 eggs per gram from these parasites. So the cattle act like a sponge. They ingest the same food, they eat the parasites, they themselves are not harmed by those parasites, but those parasites come off the landscape, which allows the donkeys to do better and increase their growth rate. And so we know the mechanism by which the facilitation is taking place. So that then provides the rancher, the commercial rancher, with an understanding of why zebras, or their surrogate donkeys, should be allowed to use the landscape because they'll have a beneficial effect in changing the structure, the greenness, and the parasite levels. We can now move to our financially strapped or smallholders. And culling of plain zebras, as I indicated, was something the Kenya Wildlife Service allowed the smallholders to do. The large commercial ranchers didn't want to hunt because the hunting can scare the wildlife so they don't get to see them, a quality of life argument. But the smallholders who are strapped for income will, in fact, prefer to hunt. And the way we can predict what populations are going to be is to use what we call a population projection matrix, which is what I have here in its simplest form. Here it's a stage-structured population matrix where we have I for infants, J for juveniles and adults in year T. And we want to predict how many infants, juveniles, and adults will be there next year. And the way to do that is you use a matrix of fecundities, shown in yellow, or survival for each of these stages, shown in the blue, which didn't show here, in this part of the matrix. All these terms are what we call density dependent. Crowding changes them. When crowding occurs, then in fact, survival goes down because food is less available. Or fecundity goes down because the females don't have the resources to have enough milk to raise their babies. So all these terms will be a function of density. That's what this indicates here. Now, we've done a lot of mark recapture studies. We know the zebras by their stripes individually. So we can look at the population growth rate and measure and tune this model based on the parameters of survival by these age classes and fecundity. So from doing lots of observations, we have all these terms, and we can then run the model year in and year out and project forward what's going on. And this is, if you leave zebras to themselves, their numbers, when we started the study in 1998, there were 30,000 zebras. If you go 30 years out in your projection, zebra numbers oscillate around, but they go up to about 50,000. Zebras can take care of themselves if people are not on the landscape. Now, if people are on the landscape, then, and you allow 10% culling, And the Kenya Wildlife Service allowed 15% culling of the population. If you allow 10% culling, the population goes extinct in 30 years. This is plain zebra that's doing well in most of East Africa and Southern Africa. If, however, you limit the culling by just 4% down to 6%, and you cull randomly, males and females, and youngsters and oldsters, so we don't make it too difficult for the hunter. You just let them hunt whatever they want to hunt. You will get the population declining at first, but it'll come to a new equilibrium, an equilibrium of about 25,000 zebras. So yes, the carrying capacity goes down, but it goes down to a stable point. And so in a very real sense, the culling at a level of about 6%, which is lower than the Kenya Wildlife Service indicated was possible, is ecologically sustainable. And so we report this to the Kenya Wildlife Service, and they then change the regulations and lower the culling level. Now, in fact, they've lowered the culling level to 0 for political reasons, but before they did that, they adopted a policy that matched our predictions. Now, is that the real number that matters? Probably is too high. We probably need to lower this to 5% for the following reason. We have done experiments looking at cortisol levels in the dung of various zebras on different types of populations. On conservancies like Impala that are unmanipulated, the stress level as measured by cortisol is very, very low. But where males are hunted, where hunters go out and they shoot the males, because male skin is more valuable than female skin, because male zebras are black and white and females are brown and white. And if you hunt bachelor males, which don't have many nicks on their skin, then those skins will fetch an even higher price in South Africa. So the pressure is to hunt males, especially bachelor males, and young stallions. Those populations' stress level is higher. But the stress level is not on the males that survive, it's on the females that survive. Now this is where the basic biology comes in again, because what do we learn about the society? It's a wagon wheel where the stallion is the hub that reduces sexual harassment. If you take away that stallion, those females don't have their protector, and as a consequence, every other male wants to mate with them. Their foraging efficiency goes down, they can't rear their babies, their stress level is high, and hence 6% is assuming a high recruitment. This is going to lower recruitment. So probably 5% would be adequate. But is this 5 or 6% economically viable? Does it make sense to allow culling? Does utilization generate enough profit to deal with the hassles of possible black market sales of meat and skins? And the answer is yes. Here I've put it on a background that's a little hazy because these are back-of-the-envelope calculations. Laikipia, as we've seen, is 10,000 square kilometers. Zebra numbers under our model would be a new carrying capacity of about 25,000. Hence, the density is about 2.5 zebras per square kilometer, or to change into American units, it's about 10 zebras per 1,000 acres. If a smallholder had 5,000 acres, then the expected number of zebras moving across his landscape on a yearly basis would be about 50, which means if we had a yearly quota of 6%, we would allow him to hunt 3 zebras per year. Now, if the zebra is worth about the same as a cow, which it is, about $250, then he nets $750 per year, which means about 9 to 12 months, depending on what he pays his workers. So it pays the salary of a worker by allowing him to utilize 3 zebras per year. Is the glass half full? Is the glass half empty? I would argue that it's probably half full, because that's a real savings in terms of worker salaries for someone that is just eking out a living on a landscape. And so from the point of view of a smallholder, if the government allowed utilization, then it could be profitable and increase the lifestyle quality of this type of herder. But now let's move to the pastoralists themselves, really financially challenged. Can they make a living on a landscape, especially the ones in the arid zones where they're coping with Grevy's zebra, whose numbers are declining? So why are Grevy's zebra's numbers declining? Darwin had 3 major predictions. Competition, predation, or disease will limit most species. But also on top of that, are people in their herds playing a significant role? We know from conservancies like Lewa that there's asymmetric competition occurring between the 2 zebra species. Locally, in a small area, as the percentage of plain zebras in a mixed herd increase, the foraging rate of Grevy's zebra is depressed statistically significantly. On the other hand, as the number of Grevy's zebras surrounding plain zebra increases, there's no statistically significant decline in the grazing rate of the plains zebra. So immediately we see asymmetric composition, that plains zebras harm Grevy's zebras, but Grevy's zebras don't harm plains zebras. So even on conservancies, the plains zebras, as their numbers go up, start to limit the ability of Grevy's zebras to ingest food, which has to lower their recruitment potential. How about predation? We've been able to develop a technique using ordinary light microscopy where we collect the hairs in the dung of lions. And we can tell the bovids from the zebras because the medulla is often broken, and that's why you get those beige colors as opposed to large black and white stripes. The Grevy's and the plains zebra can be told apart because of the difference in the size of the medulla and the cortex. One is relatively large, and one is relatively large, the medulla to the cortex in the Grevy zebra. It's smaller in the plains zebra. We did all this analysis on skins of shot animals so we could figure out whether we could statistically tell these apart. And once we were able to do that, then we collected the dung. We took out 20 hairs from lions, and we were able to examine that 93% of the scat samples of lions had zebra dung in them. 68% of the scat with zebra hair contained Grevy zebra hair. But most importantly, 56% of the zebra kills are Grevy zebras. Now, given on LEWA that there's 1,600 plains zebras for 400 Grevy zebras, your expectation if lions were hunting randomly would be a quarter, not 56%. So this is highly statistically significant, showing that lions prefer to hunt Grevy zebra. Is it because they're slightly larger? Possibly. Or is it because their social system is different, where the male is not there to protect the females when they're young, because he's off wandering and patrolling and marking his territory, looking for the next female that's in estrus. And so the social system may be implicated that causes Grevy zebra to do less well when lion predation is a problem. And the third Darwin's force is that of parasitism, but we see here it's not likely. Grevy zebra have lower parasite levels than plains zebra. So there's two strikes, lion predation and competition. Two of Darwin's hostile forces show that even on a natural landscape, where there's plenty of plains zebras and plenty of lions, Grevy zebra is not doing particularly well. Now, why are there so many lions? There are so many lions because these conservancies want to please their ecotourists who would like to see Grevy zebra, but they like to see lions even more. And so they encourage lions to stay at high abundance. And you can see that that's a problem for the Grevy zebra. So again, we work with Kenya Wildlife Service talking about multiple zonation systems for conservation. That areas where lions are not at risk, like in Laikipia, but where Grevy's are, maybe lion numbers should be curtailed so that Grevy's can do well. So far, the government is not particularly supportive of multiple strategies for a country. They like one size fits all, but as a consequence, Grevy zebra, even on the protected lands like a conservancy, are not doing particularly well. So what happens where you've got pastoralists? And pastoralists, as you can see, like to monopolize water from basically 7 o'clock in the morning till 5 o'clock at night. And in many areas, they fence the water so that no one can drink the water overnight as well, so that the water stays there for the herds the next day. Those that are somewhat wealthy put chain link fences around it. Others just Boma-ize it in the traditional way with acacia thorn scrub. And here's a typical area in one of our Samburu communities where the livestock are using the water. And so when we look at that, we want to do a study on, is this having an impact? And what we've done is we've started a scout program where we hire women and men to go about their normal daily activities. Women, when they go into the woodlands to kill firewood and water, get check sheets just like the men who herd the animals in the more open habitats. Whenever they see a Grevy zebra, they record lots of data. We give them a Garmin GPS, so they give us a GPS location, so we have an exact spot. And then they record the openness of the habitat, the presence or absence of water, what type of water, is it a stream or a watering point, the presence or absence of livestock, other wildlife. But most importantly, they record, based on these little iconic images of the animals, the males, the females, the adults, the bachelors, and the infants and juveniles, by sex, whether they're standing, walking, or eating. So they get all this data for us. We pay them, so they economically benefit Okay, so they earn an income, and we pay them $3 a day, which is a huge income in this area. When we started the project, and this money comes from American zoos, in particular St. Louis and San Diego Zoo. They partner with us because they've got in their collections Grevy zebra, so they are very supportive of our project. We paid people 1 day a week, and the women said, you pay us 2 days a week. So we said, sure, we can pay you 2 days a week. They work 50 weeks a year, so they make $300 a year. We then analyze the data and then go with workshops to the community. So here's one of our scouts presenting what she does, and then we present the results. And we make these cartoon figures, which capture our statistical analyses. And here's one such analysis, initial findings in 2003, 2004. Here's time of day across the x-axis, and here are the sizes of the Grevy's herds that we see. Early in the morning, small herds. At night, larger herds. We put the Simba here just simply because everyone knows that's why zebras congregate at night to stay away from the lions. Or at least everybody thinks they know that. But then we start posing some tough questions to the communities at our workshop. Well, why, if the herds are large at night, are they small in the morning? And the first thing you get is the women and the men start screaming at each other. The women start saying, you put your dogs on the zebras, that's why they run away. And the men say, no, you throw your sticks and stones at them because you don't want them in the way when you're going to collect your firewood and water. And they all chuckle at that, but they all know it's true. So the herds are broken up at night into small in the morning. But the question then becomes, why do the herds get larger before it gets dark, before the lion's active? And at this point, all of the community, men and women, start looking at their feet. They don't want to talk about it. They know the answer. They know it's their behavior, that because the livestock are monopolizing the water all day, the Grevy zebra are standing around waiting to drink and not grazing. So the headman finally says, the elder finally comes up and says, okay, we're the problem, we know that. Maybe we can go home at 4:30 instead of 5 o'clock. Well, that's not going to be enough. And so we started to wrestle with what do we do to change people's behavior? How do we get the Grevy zebra? We know water is so important to be able to drink. So we didn't have any solutions, but we started the conversation. It turned out we didn't have to have a solution to that problem. The solution emerged from a change in people's behavior spontaneously. We also showed them that if we make the assumption that the livestock are on the best grassland, that's this fine grain here, and the Grevy zebra are stuck on the coarse grain, poorer grassland here, and this is our data, about 30% of the sightings of zebras from the check sheets showed that they were seen with livestock, where 70% were seen by themselves. If that in fact is true, then this may be the smoking gun. That the females, especially those without foals that have just finished lactating, who need to fatten up to get their body condition up to conceive again, are being denied access to the good grasslands where the livestock are. Can we then change their behavior on this trait? And so we went to the community. We showed them those cartoons, but this is the data that was used for those cartoons. Territorial males, bachelor males, non-lactating females below expectation. Lactating females, about 30% are seen with livestock and 70% are not. And we presented those results, and we presented them again the second year. And the Marani, the warriors, jumped up and said, Professor, we've changed our behavior. We don't any longer throw our sticks and stones and put our dogs on the animals. And I said, well, that's really interesting. And sure enough, as we were having the workshop around the water hole, in came the cattle with the Grevy zebra behind them. And I said, okay, but I can test that. I have another year's worth of data. I can actually go see if your behavior has changed. And they said, it will be changed, Professor. Sure enough, 50% of the sightings in 2005 have the Grevy zebra seen with livestock. So they changed their behavior. And by allowing them to coexist with the livestock, it took care of the watering problem. Because if they're with the livestock and the livestock come to drink at noon, which is when zebras prefer to drink, then the zebras got to drink at noon. And so what we have is a total change in the herd structure by daytime. In fact, you get large herds all through the day because they can come and go to water, and the herds are in fact smaller at night when the lions are active. So it's a much healthier landscape now. You've got the Grevy zebra and the cattle grazing side by side and drinking side by side. But this can only be a beginning, because this is supporting 2 or 3 families per community. Now, $300 is used wisely by the women. They spend it on their children. they improve their health, they improve their schooling. The men are less good with spending the money on their children. Some of it goes to the children, but more of it goes to wine and women before it gets to the children. But even more importantly than that is how do we spread the wealth away from just 3 families per community? And this is particularly important because the area where we're working is right on the edge of always emergency food problems. Not surprisingly, between 1996 and 2006, we had 5 droughts, 1 El Nino flood, which has led to major overstocking and overgrazing on the pastoral landscapes, which are exactly right here in Laikipia. And so this is where solutions require better science to improve management. And we've got 3 new projects in operation for us better studying animal movements, how they use the landscape and where they go, better understanding of the water cycle, and improved education to increase the quality of stewardship for the next generation. The movement stuff, the movement work comes from our development of better sensor GPS collars where we can track the animal's movements over landscapes day and night. And in the process, we've learned a lot about these animals that at night they change their behavior markedly. Instead of meandering slowly and in straight lines on the grazing open lands, they go into the forest and they move slowly in the forest most of the night. That's when the lions come out on the grassland. For those zebras that must stay on the grassland, they change their behavior, become rapid, erratic movers who have high turning angles. So we've learned a lot about just how zebras use the landscape differently from these GPS collars. A GPS collar is one that gets a fix from satellites, just like we do with the Garmin that we give to the workers to follow the animals. We've also now been able to put collars on livestock to see how livestock and zebras push each other around on the landscape. So we've tried to understand the movements, but we're also now trying to understand bottom-up factors in terms of water dynamics. As we've seen, water is the key to understanding the Grevy's zebra behavior. But it's also the key to understanding livestock movements, because what do people do? They put their animals in corrals at night to protect them from lions. They then move them out to water to drink at midday, and then they come back to the corral at night. So both the livestock and the wildlife need to get to water. They need to get to water at important times of the day so they can organize their daily cycle to reduce risks of predation, either controlled by people or controlled by themselves, by the wildlife. So we've tried to integrate hydrology, ecology, and politics, people's values and decision-making, into understanding how animals use the landscape. We create spatial models for forecasting, like the models we saw rejecting population size, but now we do it on a spatial basis so we can figure out ways to intervene. But the only ways we're going to intervene effectively is we understand how people govern their land and how they punish cheats so that they mutually coerce each other in ways that make sense. Only by understanding that will any better mousetrap in terms of recommendations we make be acceptable to people. And we hope then that will improve lifestyles while simultaneously conserving wildlife. We do it by this sort of model here under the Owasso project. We understand climate. We've seen that there's been big changes. Trenton Franz, one of the graduate students in geology, not in geology, in civil and environmental engineering, has demonstrated that over the last 65 years that the rainfall level has stayed constant, but the inter-rainfall interval has gotten wider, which means when it does rain, it rains more heavily, which increases runoff and less infiltration in the soil. And he's built models to predict how that's affecting grassland and tree dynamics. So we can understand how the climate affects the available water, which affects the vegetation. We in my group are looking at the livestock-wildlife interaction, and others in the politics department are looking at how societies govern themselves in terms of property rights and sharing out resources. And then the key is understanding the feedbacks that go downward, both the human ones in blue and the natural ones in red. So that's what we're working on now. But lastly, we're also working with the children. When we go into a community and have workshops with the adults, we also go to the schools. And what's really interesting is in the schools, half the community marches with us to the schools, and the parents sit up front and watch their children. So when we have the lessons with the kids, the parents are validating it and staring at their children like, you better listen, you better get this. And the kids really do. Okay, now the schools are overcrowded, the resources are very minimal, there's no textbooks, people put things up on the walls. And what we did is we first had workshops with the teachers and liaison members of the community. Because even though you may think Kenya is different from Princeton, it's not. Teachers get transferred all the time. And so the only people that are going to be in the schools for long periods of time are the parents, the members of the community. So we had workshops with the teachers and the community members, and we asked them what they wanted. They said, we want a basic course in ecology and conservation biology, so we provided that. They wanted a curriculum guide, which we produced. They wanted it to include indigenous knowledge, that kids should go interview the elders and their parents and their grandparents to find out what life was like and what the landscape was like in the previous generation. So we've put together, thanks to the San Diego Zoo and the St. Louis Zoo and a few other zoos, curriculum guides and kits that allow these working lessons to take place. Now the curriculum is crowded in Kenya. You can't do it during school hours, but clubs are part of the curriculum after school. And we've taken over the Wildlife Clubs of Kenya slot that doesn't work up in the north. And we've created the Northern Kenya Conservation Clubs. The teachers that have come get a certificate. And in fact, one of the teachers took the certificate, went to an NGO and said, I'm now a conservation biologist, and quadrupled his salary and left the schools. So there's always the law of unintended consequences. But nonetheless, by participating, it encouraged people to understand the dynamics. And it was a headmaster in the Nagadoni school that basically came up after one of our workshops and said, it's wonderful that you come. It's wonderful that you teach our kids a lesson on conservation. It's wonderful that you talk about Grevy's zebra, but my teachers can't sustain this. When are they going to learn basic ecological thinking and conservation? And that's what led to these workshops. We now have active clubs in the schools, and those clubs have demonstrations from scientists like Katie Prager, who was an undergraduate here, but now doing her PhD after her vet degree at UC Davis. One of the research assistants coming in and talking about carnivores. She studies jackals and disease spread, especially rabies, between wild dogs and domestic dogs and jackals. So she's showing the kids how she traps her animals. We've worked out games to show kids the basic problems that wildlife has. So this game is called On Guard, and I've modified it from a standard game where the kids bend down and pick up stones as if they're eating grass, and they do it as a single individual. Then is 2, then is 3, then is 4, then is 5, and all the other kids line up on the outside, and I tap one of them to be the lion. And if they can get in and grab the clothespin off the student's back, the zebra, is dead. But if the zebra can call out the student's name before the clothespin is used, then the lion has been thwarted, the zebra's gotten away. And they quickly learn that a singleton zebra always gets eaten. But once you're up to a group of 5, the zebras never get eaten. And the number of stones that each zebra has, number of grass blades they've eaten, is higher. So it's a double win. And so they learn the fundamentals of the trade-offs that animals face on a landscape by doing, because their normal curriculum is rote memorization and recitation. So by having them active after school, they learn so much more, as we know is the case with our undergraduates. We also have them acting out. They go on drives to see wildlife for the first time. You know, we take it for granted that when we go to Kenya, we see wildlife. These kids in the schools in their communities don't get out because without a car, you get eaten by a lion, so you never stray very far. And there's very little wildlife around the villages, so they don't see the wildlife that we see. But the Impala Research Center has a bus, a school bus, that takes kids to the school, and we use it for not only the Impala kids, but the kids on the group ranches, where we have 3 other clubs and 3 other schools. So they see animals, they watch with binoculars, they talk about the behavior, and this kid is getting a task. He reached into a hat and it said, become a zebra dust bathing. And the other kids had to guess what he's doing here in the picture, which is what he saw. So it reinforces what they see on the wildlife. These kids go home and tell their parents. The parents are excited that the kids are seeing the landscape. And we think by having this active learning, the kids are going to become better connected to their environment and become better stewards in tomorrow's world. So the question then is, can the livelihoods of pastoral people, our third group, the most impoverished, can they be benefited by understanding basic science and conservation? Can we increase their sustainable herding and reduce the risk of tragedy of the commons? Absolutely. We've demonstrated over and over again that they become empowered once they're engaged. They change their behavior very quickly. So by working with them and bringing them into the process, they can become the solution to the problems that they have helped create. But is that going to be enough? Is that going to generate enough wealth to tip the balance? Is there more money in ecotourism? Is the education that we're providing through our clubs sufficient, or do we need to get them to graduate high school and increase their chances of going to college? And are there jobs to justify an investment in education? Because parents are very savvy. If there's no future to sending a kid to high school, the kid will stay home and raise more cattle, more sheep, more goats, and more camels. Are there jobs? At the moment, there are none because there's very little investment in Kenya. But we as conservation biologists, are we doing enough to parallel process, to work with multinational corporations to help get more jobs, to destock the land, to provide opportunities for kids that are educated, and in the process, empower them to run their own lodges like in Ilangwesi so that they can make more money that can come from sustainable herding. All questions that we don't have the answer, but a process that has begun by involving communities in understanding of how science can improve their livelihoods and reduce the tragedy that comments. So better science for better networking at all levels will do the trick. We've demonstrated tonight that natural engineering and social sciences, by working together, can provide insights to increase biodiversity conservation as well as improve livelihoods for three different types of stakeholders. The key is that conservation and management actions can be sustainable only if local communities, and that's three different types of stakeholders, believe in the goals of our scientific projects, understand the value of the knowledge that emerges, so they must be empowered, engaged, and understand what's occurring, and can put it to profitable use. Can wildlife pay to stay? I think the answer is yes, but whether it's going to pay enough in the next 5 or 10 years to sustain themselves and people who want refrigerators and cars and everything else that people want in the Western world, will that put too much pressure on the landscape if we don't create more opportunities for increased wealth in ways that don't follow the Western style that lead to harm on the landscape? So with that, I'll conclude. A lot of people are involved in the project, a lot of different supporters, and we're covering a lot of ground, and I'm fairly optimistic that the glass is half full. Thank you. I'll take any questions.
Is it possible, and would it be beneficial to crossbreed the two types of zebras?
They naturally form hybrids at the southern edge of the range, but whenever you have a crossbred individual, you've got problems of gene flow, which destroys the species concept. In the United States, that's a real serious problem. So if you have panthers and wolves and things from different states crossing into other states, so that an endangered population all of a sudden has genes from Texas, they're no longer endangered because they've been corrupted, so therefore they're no longer protected. So it's an issue that conservation biologists don't want to go to. But also then, what is the hybrid species that you have? It's neither X nor Y, and therefore, is it something you want to protect, or is it something that is vermin? Right now, the few hybrids we have naturally between Grevy's and plain zebra, some of them are fertile. And there's a big debate, should they be exterminated because they are neither fish nor fowl. So it's an interesting dilemma. I think the way the genes are flowing, they're flowing from Grevy's zebra into plain zebra. So the Grevy's zebra is not endangered of being corrupted. But on the other hand, they're not gaining any of the benefits of the plain zebra adaptations to this habitat. So those crossbreeding are probably not going to enhance the survival prospects of the Grevy's.
Are there any vegetables, any kind of food that could be massively planted and spread to increase the possibility of food and better control of water?
So agriculture will always trump pastoralism. But the problem is, in a non-irrigated landscape, vegetables don't grow because water, rainfall, is highly unpredictable. You've got an average of 400 to 500 millimeters of rainfall in pulses that can sometimes miss. I showed the data that in a 10-year period from 1996 to 2006, there were 5 droughts. Now, a drought is when 2 rainy seasons are missed. When there's 2 rainy seasons, you basically have a desert. And the grasses can maintain themselves, even though you don't see them there, through their rootstock, as long as they haven't been overgrazed year after year, because even then the grasses can't come back. So a landscape like this has never gone agricultural anywhere in the world unless you irrigate it. There's not enough water in the rivers because the flower farms, the roses that you buy for $9.99 at the gas station, use up all the water. So this is a landscape that traditionally would be totally inhospitable to people if it weren't for the livestock. Because what the livestock do is they eat this vegetation that's got thorns, that has alkaloids, that's full of silica, and convert it into animal products that we can eat. Now, we don't have to kill the animals because we can use milk and blood, which is what the pastoralists live on. They'll make a yogurt type of food that they take with them when they go and they herd their animals. And so they can use the animals without killing the animals. They do kill animals for rituals, but for the most part, they use the animals and they husband it just like you would if you coppiced a tree. But it's too dry for agriculture in this landscape.
There's no way to have a program of conservation for it.
There's no water. Okay? Where would you get it from? You'd have to pipe it from somewhere else where people are using it not necessarily
But
wisely.
there are areas in Africa that
They do, but they're not pastoral lands. Pastoral lands, you'd have to move, the pipes would have to move it hundreds and hundreds of kilometers from now Kenya to this area. Now, what happens is aid groups often listen to people that say, we need to put water at the school. Now, the school is usually far away from the river for safety reasons, because buffalo are down by the river. So it's far away from the river, and that's the thin edge of the wedge. So a church organization will often build a water tank. And then some church organization will also donate the pipes. Another church organization will donate the pump. And the water gets to the school. And what happens? It breaks. But before it breaks, then all of a sudden people open the tap and the goats and the sheep start grazing there where they might not have grazed before. So the few natural refuges where the livestock, like wildlife, where the Grevy's zebra can go, especially the ones that are not lactating, to the upland areas where there's still vegetation, all of a sudden the livestock are there, which increases the stocking rate and causes more harm. So sometimes the best intentions of people listening to the wishes of local people tend to change the landscape markedly so that it destroys more wildlife. So water is a tricky business, understanding water dynamics. That's why we're studying water.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic about some of the other species, especially rhinoceros and elephants in Africa?
I think rhinos are fine because they're highly protected. People that want rhinos get rhinos, and they put guards on individual rhinos, or they fence in certain ways that let the other wildlife come through, but they build the posts to keep the rhinos in, and they put rocks where rhinos don't cross over. So I think rhino numbers are increasing, both black and white, on these conservancies, because that's one of the ways to get ecotourism, because people want to see the big five, and rhino is one of them. So I think rhinos are okay. Elephants are also okay, until very recently. Elephant numbers in Laikipia have been going up. Elephants, believe it or not, breed like bunny rabbits. They just have a long birth interval. But every 4 years, a female gives birth to one, and the baby doesn't get eaten by lions, and so therefore the baby survives. So elephant numbers increase very, very quickly, as long as they're not poached by humans. And it was the moratorium on the ban of ivory sales, which is taking place right now, is increased the poaching. We're losing 4 elephants per week in Laikipia because they're trying to commingle the ivory from East Africa, which is small, into the legal South African ivory that can be sold for a year to the Asian markets. Okay? Because the South Africans have argued that they have all this stockpile of resources, and if they want to fund people's livelihoods and fund conservation, they should be allowed to sell the products and therefore generate that money into livelihood improvement and conservation. Now, while that makes sense, it creates a black market. And so areas that don't have enough resources to police for poaching, like in Kenya, means that the elephant numbers are going to take a hit for a year. So numbers we're seeing holding constant. But again, elephants have been breeding like bunny rabbits, and the numbers have been going up. So the question is it going to be in some stable equilibrium for a year, and then it's going to take off again? We just don't know. We just don't know. But I think elephants and rhinos are doing okay because the public wants to see those. The government has invested in that. There's a question over here.
About how many years do you believe it will be before you know how successful your programs are?
Well, we're starting to see Grevy's numbers starting to level off. We're not starting to see declines anymore. So from our small sample where we're working, we're starting to see more baby recruitment. So I think we actually do understand the dynamics that by working with people to get them to allow water usage, then the non-lactating females are increasing. And the interbirth interval is shrinking, so they're able to recruit more babies into the population. The pressure of lions is a problem, but lions tend to magically sometimes disappear. They get translocated somewhere, okay? And so lion numbers in certain areas are staying constant and not increasing. So I think we may have turned the corner on Grevy's, that the numbers are not declining, they'll hold constant for a while. The real question is there enough wealth being generated by the current practices to encourage people to continue with the behavior that they're showing? And that's the big question. And we need to then start working with other providers of jobs so that wealth can increase at a faster rate.
If the water supply is lower, will they still allow the wild animals to come in to share?
They are doing so, yeah. They're doing so. Yeah. Yeah. The amount of water that the livestock are using is, if you let the wildlife use it, it doesn't really decrease the number of days substantially, because what's happening is the rainfall and the puddle size is smaller, but it decays. Instead of maybe 3 weeks, it decays in 2 weeks, just naturally, and the drinking obviously speeds it up, but a lot of it's evaporating. And what happens is when you get rainfall, you get a lot of little puddles, and that spreads the animals out. So they're using very opportunistic water that occurs in tire tracks, in any slight depression, and that water is the water that allows everybody to benefit.
I think your contact with the people, the school children and the teachers is fantastic, and that will have terrific effects in the future. Having them see you guys and what you're doing, do you see changes in them?
Well, we do. I mean, the teachers very much want us to come into the schools now. We supply them with teaching supplies for all year. Princeton University Press has donated field guides of mammals and birds, so it's the first time that these 4 communities in Laikipia and the 8 communities in Samburu actually have pictures of the animals that they see in their communities, and they can put names to them. So everybody's playing their part. Denver Zoo has given us, they've had sales, and it doesn't cost much to keep these kits supplied. It's a big metal box with notebooks and pencils. They've raised $300. The Princeton Grand Challenge program, which comes from a lot of our trustees, is generating most of the money for these clubs. So there is a lot of financial support that keeps it going. So as long as we're consistent, the worst thing that can happen is you start something and stop it. As long as we're consistent and we have people that will continue to supply the resources and people that will give the time, then we can keep training the next generation of teachers. And we're empowering people. So like Wilson in Diderot, who is one of the research assistants. In fact, my son's research assistant. His mother is the kindergarten teacher at the Impala School. And he's got his silver certificate. He's gone off to the Kenya Wildlife Service. He has been trained as a naturalist. He was a ranger for Kenya Wildlife Service. Didn't like it, come back to Impala to be with his parents. But he's a natural teacher. And so we give him 2 days a week off from his duties of watching bird behavior to go out to the communities and work with the teachers. We then have workshops once every 6 weeks where we bring the teachers together. So we go over, and I teach him, and he then teaches them how the curriculum guide the next 6 units. So it's designed for their 3 semesters. And so he then works with them on how to run the lessons and not lecture to the kids. So we're trying to change the way the kids learn to make it more active so that they participate more. Again, it doesn't take a lot, but it takes consistency, that we have to be there to help him so he can help them.
How did the upheaval following the elections last year affect your project?
We're in the middle of nowhere. We're in the middle of nowhere. You know, Kenya Wildlife Service doesn't care about us, doesn't care about these people for the most part. So that's one of the reasons we've been so successful, because we work with the people directly. We have very little government assistance or interference.
And none of those people had to relocate?
No, we're in the middle of nowhere. You know, this is an arid landscape. There's not a lot of jobs. A land is not particularly valuable. No one wanted it, so it's basically been doing its own thing.
One more, if there is.
Do they still use the Cambridge education system?
The which system?
Cambridge education system.
No, they use the Kenyan education system, the KSE. I mean, they're using their national exams. And, you know, the parents are just as uptight as their parents, you know. They want their kids to do really, really, really well. And so they like the clubs because the clubs provide them with an understanding, and their kids seem to be doing well.
Thank you.
Thank you.